President, ladies and gentlemen, communism was the most murderous system in the history of mankind, more murderous perhaps than the German National Socialism. As somebody who for many years lived in the communist country, I feel it my duty to repeat this truth over and over again. And I'm afraid what I'm going to say will be rather bitter and out of tune with what has been said before. The division between those who supported communism and those that opposed it at that time was far from clear. Let me remind you that in the 1970s and 1990s, the Soviet Union became a vital part of the international order and was accepted as such. The West European governments conducted realpolitik towards the Soviet regime and accommodated its aspirations. And for the same reason, those governments looked at the anti-communist movements within the Soviet bloc with suspicion, treating them as troublemakers, courageous, politically naive, yet jeopardizing the international order. These movements disturbed the détente, they disturbed Ostpolitik, they stood in the way of the policy of the majority of West European governments who had been for a long time openly pro-Soviet. So the involvement of the Western elites in the legitimization of communism had serious consequences. The communists continued their career afterwards, after the system fell. And some of them joined the European Parliament, joined the European institutions, some are still here. They rebranded themselves as social democrats, jumped from the bandwagon called the Soviet system to another bandwagon, which is called the European Union. And they were greeted heartily. Overnight, the apparatchiks, the Parteigenosse, became enthusiastically European, super duper European. The communist system should have discredited the political left in Europe. Unfortunately, it didn't. In fact, the left acquired a dominant position in Europe after the demise of the Soviet Union. The Christian, democratic, conservative, Republican parties have capitulated to the left agenda, which I find rather pathetic. And as a result, the spirit of communism lives on in Europe. It has been, of course, it has been recycled, has been garnished, has been updated, has been slightly civilized, remodeled, but it is there all right. The left always had totalitarian temptations, and no wonder they continue the policies which I remember very well from my young days living in the communist society. Today, we are more and more in the grip of one correct ideology with political correctness running wild. We had a sample of it here, right here at this session. We tend to create a new form of de facto one-party system, which is called political mainstream. Again, we had a sample of it this afternoon. We have militant, aggressive secularism and barbaric social engineering. Again, these were the trademarks of the communist system. We have neo-Marxists very much alive and kicking today. So all this considered, ladies and gentlemen, the anniversary is fine. We all remember those great days, but it's not time for sentimental ruminations. It's not time for political self-righteousness. It's time for a revision. And I mean it. Mr. President, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, 3 points. First, point number one, We meet here in exceptional circumstances. We are discussing the sweeping changes to our climate and energy goals brought forward by the Euro Commission no sooner than 10 days since taking office and before our recent existing climate agreements have been implemented. This is ambitious, but it is not prudent. Point number two. In the ECR, we had hoped the new Commission would be more cautious than the last one, that it would work with member states and within the treaties. If you read the treaties, Article 15, it's stated very clearly, it is the European Council who define the political direction of EU policies. And the European Council meets tomorrow to discuss, guess what? The EU's long-term climate policy. So I ask myself, why are we here today? Is the Commission trying to seize the initiative to take away power from the member states? When we look back, we can see that in 2014, the European Council unanimously agreed that 2030 targets delivered with compromise after painstaking negotiations. And today's headline goal of achieving climate neutrality by 2050 should have followed the same path, and member state governments should not be sidelined on something this fundamental. Point number three, Madam President. In recent months, we have heard so much about the green wave sweeping Europe. But have you noticed that when this wave reaches the Baltic and travels down the Danube, it is not even a ripple? Why? Because in Central and Eastern Europe, we can see through it. We see a confused strategy that prompts more questions than it answers. Are the Commission's new climate goals credible and achievable? And what will this do to our industries? You pictured some sort of a paradise. Who wouldn't like to live in a paradise? But will this convince millions of Europeans? How have the new Commission, in 10 days since taking office, been able to fully understand how dramatically our economies could change as a result of this Green Deal? Have you an idea of social costs as well as personal tragedies it will generate? Point number four, which I wanted to omit, but I will just indicate it briefly. It's about gas. We see a completely confused strategy here. Gas is going to be an essential part of decarbonizing in the coming years. A new legislation agreed recently prohibits future investment in gas. This is certainly confusion. So to conclude, Madam President, how we move forwards has to be credible and achievable. Otherwise, you can have all the talk and targets in the world, but they will count for nothing if you can't actually meet them. And when you try to do it by force, the consequences might be disastrous. Thank you, Mr. President. Madam President, the last decade has been rather turbulent for the European Union. The problems will, of course, continue. The EU today is in a worse shape than it was 10 years ago. I therefore find it rather puzzling that every year over the last decade, we have heard from every Commission President that the radiant future is awaiting us and that the days of the EU glory are just round the corner, provided, of course, that the European Commission, European institutions get more competences. You must be aware, Madam President, that fewer and fewer people across Europe take this message seriously. European Health Agency, European Cloud, European Bauhaus. I wonder if the new European architecture will resemble this building. What a frightening perspective. Madam President, the gist of your argument today was that the pandemic crisis is a good opportunity to launch ambitious radical programs, including the Green Deal. I'm sorry to say, but this is bad argument. This is bad logic, and bad logic generates bad policy. What you are proposing is a great leap forward in a situation in which the future is more precarious than ever. The Green Deal with 55%, why not 60%, is a costly extravaganza animated solely by a spirit of environmentalist crusade, not by a sober social and economic calculation. Now, a few words about so-called rule of law provisions. I said so-called because it has nothing to do with rule or with law. The whole idea, as you remember, was an iniquitous trick of the previous Commission in complete disregard to the treaties, in the intention to bully the governments that dissented from the mainstream. It is not what they do, those governments do, because they don't do anything objectionable, but what they are. And the previous Commission let a malignant genie out of the bottle, a genie of political foul play, and they are not interested in putting it back. This so-called conditionality is another step towards complete lawlessness, the prospect which makes the majority of my colleagues almost ecstatic. Madam President, do not be deluded by this sanctimonious rhetoric you hear in this chamber. As usual, behind sanctimoniousness, there is ugly politics and there is hypocrisy. What this rule of law politics amounts to is brutal majoritarianism. The mainstream majority wants to crush every form of dissent. And do not open the door for more instruments of the tyranny of the majority, as you promised you would do it. That was the scariest part of your speech. This is already getting uglier and uglier, wilder and more mendacious. The European institutions want to switch off democratically constituted institutions of the nation states. They instigate internal conflicts by endorsing some parties against other parties. This is not your business. You shouldn't do it. So this is political arrogance at its worst. Let me conclude. If we continue, if you and your Commission will continue on the current course, the course espoused by many of my fellow group leaders here this morning, Europe will be wrecked. I repeat, Europe will be wrecked, caught in an ideological pincer movement orchestrated by green and federalist extremists. Mr. Juncker will forever be remembered as the Commission President who lost Britain. You, Mrs. von der Leyen, must make sure that you are not the President who lost the peoples of Europe. I urge you, work with member states, not with the ideologically driven campaigns masquerading as political groups in this House. Save the European Union from ideology and return it to reality.
Pani Przewodnicząca, Pani Komisarz, tekst przygotowany przez Parlament jest absurdalny i pokazuje, że ta Izba stała się wielką ideologiczną machiną, która chce w Unii stworzyć nowego człowieka za wszelką cenę, nawet łamiąc prawo i gwałcąc prawdę. Odnośnie prawa, artykuł 9 Europejskiej Karty Praw Podstawowych stanowi, że kwestie małżeństwa i rodziny są regulowane zgodnie z ustawami krajowymi. Jeżeli pani przewodnicząca von der Leyen mówi, że bycie rodzicem w jednym państwie członkowskim oznacza, że jest się rodzicem we wszystkich państwach członkowskich, a fraza ta jest powtórzona verbatim w tekście Parlamentu, to jest to ewidentny gwałt na artykule 9 Karty Praw Podstawowych. Gdyby rzeczywiście tak miało być, że rodzic w jednym kraju jest rodzicem we wszystkim, to artykuł 9 staje się świstkiem bez znaczenia i powinien wylądować w koszu i państwo do tego kosza rzuciliście ten artykuł. W wielu krajach, między innymi w moim, małżeństwo to związek kobiety i mężczyzny i podstawa rodziny. To jest zapisane w konstytucji. Kiedy więc samorządy bronią rodziny i nie godzą się na indoktrynację dzieci bez zgody rodziców i nie życzą sobie ideologicznych oficerów wkraczających do szkół i opowiadającym dzieciom absurdy o genderach i płynności płci, to stoją na gruncie krajowego prawa, konstytucji państwa i Europejskiej Karty Praw Podstawowych. Obrona rodziny to jest ich święte prawo i nie wolno im tego prawa odbierać. Nie ma żadnego obowiązku prawnego lub moralnego, by wpuszczać każdego indoktrynatora do szkół, nawet jeśli ten indoktrynator ma potężnych popleczników w instytucjach europejskich. A kto każe ich wpuszczać wbrew woli zarządzających szkołami, ten gwałci prawo. I cała akcja przeciw tym samorządom, również przez komisję, przez fundusze norweskie, jest bezprawna i stanowi brutalną presję. Podobnie jak dzisiejsza akcja parlamentu. To jest polityka zastraszania ludzi, zastraszania, upokarzania wspólnot. Ideologiczny amok tutaj się unosi. Nie macie szacunku dla ludzi. Jak każda radykalna lewica chcecie zrobić rewolucję. A odnośnie faktów. Sprawdźcie dane OBWE na temat tak zwanych hate crimes, szczególnie ataki na osoby homoseksualne. W jakich krajach ta liczba jest najwyższa? Dane za rok 2019. W Holandii 574 przypadki, w Niemczech 248 przypadków, w Belgii 163. W jakich najmniejsza? Na Litwie 2, w Polsce 16. Więc może powinniście mówić tutaj o Niemczech i o Belgii, a nie o Polsce i innych krajach Europy Wschodniej. Kraje Europy Zachodniej prześcigają się w akcjach ideologicznych. Już od żłobka karmicie niemowlaki genderami i płynnością płci. Oficerowie ideologiczni nie wychodzą ze szkół, mediów i korporacji. Utrudniacie badania naukowe, wprowadzacie cenzurę na te tematy, zatruwacie język i umysły polityczną poprawnością i co z tego macie? Efekt odwrotny od zamierzonego. To tam jest przemoc, nie tutaj. A zatem uspokójcie się ideologicznie, dajcie ludziom żyć, nie róbcie rewolucji, zróbcie Unię strefą wolną dla zdrowego rozsądku. Ja wiem, że to trudne, ale mimo wszystko polecam. A przynajmniej nie mówcie nieprawdy. Bo jak twierdzicie, że taki kraj jak Polska to jest kraj wrogi dla osób homoseksualnych, że u nas są strefy wolne od LGBT, to mówicie nieprawdę. Powtarzam, to jest nieprawda. A mówienie nieprawdy to jest wstyd. Wstyd, jeżeli rozumiecie jeszcze, co to słowo znaczy. Dziękuję bardzo, Pani Przewodnicząca. Thank you, Madam President. Yes, indeed. We have a serious problem with the rule of law in the European Union, but not in the member states, but in the EU itself. The violations of the treaties have become more and more frequent. What's worse, this practice seems to be accepted by the European institutions as well as by the political forces that control them. Take the so-called rule of law framework. From the very beginning, it was obvious that the treaties disallow such a procedure, if only because it violates the principle of conferral as specified in Article 5. Soon after this framework appeared in 2014, the legal services of the Council of the European Union wrote a devastating critique of the project. What did the Commission and the Parliament do? Nothing. Probably they put the document into the shredder. A couple of years later, in 2018, the same legal services presented another critical opinion, even more devastating. The same reaction, silence and the shredder. Even the European Court of Auditors criticized this mechanism, and its opinion wound up in the shredder too. Then the Parliament came up with the rule of conditionality, which in the form proposed by the Parliament is simply a legal monstrosity, violating almost everything that can be violated. What it can and probably will amount to, we have all heard in the statements of some of the speakers this afternoon, and many of those who will follow will probably continue in the same vein. To say that these remarks are being made in complete disregard for the rule of law as specified in the treaties would be an understatement. If anyone wants to know what the contempt for law is like, well, that was it. The Council introduced some rationality to the mechanism, and I can see to my satisfaction that the Commissioner does not want to go beyond what the treaties allow. I should be satisfied, and in a way I am. But we have heard other statements from other commissioners in the past with the opposite message. So I'm not sure what the Commission's ultimate position is. Aren't you by any chance playing a good cop and a bad cop game? This sense of uncertainty, which I feel is shared by millions of people in Europe. The treaties are being strained, reinterpreted at will, twisted. They no longer give protection, but have become the instruments of the ruling majority to strengthen its hegemony. This tendency, unfortunately, seems to include the Court of Justice. As you might remember, this Parliament launched Article 7 against Hungary after having introduced the last-moment change in the voting procedure, excluding abstentions. This was definitely a foul play, and without the change, the anti-Hungarian majority would have lost. And this was clearly a breach of Article 354, which explicitly stipulates that all votes cast should be included. But just recently, the Court of Justice intervened in an epoch-making ruling to the effect that abstentions are not to be qualified as votes cast. The ruling is not only an assault on human intelligence. This is law in the service of party politics. But more importantly, this is a sign that for the Court of Justice, as well as for other European institutions, anything goes as long as they can have their way. So what we have seen so far, the conditional debates in the Parliament and outside it, have been a rather depressing spectacle. Commissioner, I wish your statement could mark a change in this abominable practice of a cavalier approach to the treaties. But something is telling me that such a conclusion may be premature. And considering this Parliament's plan for the future of Europe, I fear the worst. Mr. President, Madam President, Prime Minister. Prime Minister, from what you have heard so far, you might have already guessed that you found yourself in a most peculiar place. The European Parliament is the institution first that has been governed by the same political coalition from time immemorial, rather unusual in any nation state, with predictably unfortunate consequences. Second, the coalition is decidedly left-wing, with the EPP and Donald Tusk follow suit, more and more radical, and tries to enforce their leftist views on the entire world, recently, believe it or not, on the American state of Texas. Three, it has no understanding for dissent, and therefore surrounds the dissenting groups by a cordon sanitaire, which is quite an effective way of neutralizing the opposition. And fourth, it has managed to establish a tyranny of the majority that controls everything from administration to the distribution of the key political position. So once you keep this in mind, you will understand why this Parliament has been waging a cold war against and trying to destabilize conservative governments in Europe, and why, to achieve this end, they have been violating the basic principles of the treaties and made up
the ad hoc rules that are not there. And in this inglorious task, they have been unfortunately seconded by other institutions, including the European Commission, which at least since the times of Jean-Claude Juncker and Mr. Timmermans became a political institution, strongly partisan, ideological and arrogant. The principles of conferral, subsidiarity and proportionality explicitly inscribed in the Article 5 were thrown overboard. To give an example, tomorrow there will be another chapter of Poland bashing because of our abortion law. That such matters as abortion are exclusively the competences of the nation state, who cares? The majority can outvote any restraining rule. If making 2 + 2 5 were to hurt the Polish government, they would not hesitate to put it to vote. And you know what? Chances are that they would have it carried. Having got rid of the basic principles of the treaties, they came up with their own rules, which don't exist in the treaties and which the treaties preclude. The first product of their inventive genius came from the Commission, and it was the rule of law framework. And that's then its parliamentary offspring, the rule of conditionality, an absolute outrage, a sheer monstrosity from a legal and moral point of view. So what? Might is right. The newest gizmo is the primacy of the EU law. In various public statements, this phrase has been immersed in a typical EU gobbledygook. But I would like to know what exactly you mean by making this claim, Madam President. There is not a word about it in the treaties. Where did you take it from? If not from the treaties, then where from? And what do you think it means? That the European law trumps national law in the areas over which the EU has exclusive competences? This is a rather commonsensical statement. Nobody questions it. That the European law trumps the national law in the areas over which the EU does not have any competence? But this is absurd. It would be like the primacy of the European law over the law of the state of Texas. I'm sure that the majority of my colleagues in this chamber would want precisely this, but this does not make it any less absurd. Or perhaps, by primacy, you mean that the European institutions will decide which areas are under their competence and which are not, and the national institutions will have no power to oppose their decision. But this is a very dangerous concept, extremely dangerous, because it gives the EU omnipotence and omniscience it does not have, it cannot have, and to be frank, it does not deserve. Over the last decade, the EU has turned out unable to restrain itself and respect the limits imposed by the principles of conferral, subsidiarity, and proportionality. The trust that it will stay within the treaties in the years to come is gone. You see, Madam President, we are not afraid of European law. We are afraid of European lawlessness, of the tyranny of the majority, of an abuse of power, of the cavalier use of the treaties. Despite what one can see in the Parliament and in the Commission, might is not right.
Panie Przewodniczący, Szanowni Państwo, premier rządu mojego kraju, Mateusz Morawiecki, miał tu przyjechać. Niestety nie umożliwiono mu tego, ale poprosił mnie, żebym
przekazał treści, które chciał tutaj wyrazić. Czynię to tym chętniej, że one odzwierciedlają poglądy mojej grupy, wielu milionów moich rodaków, a także mieszkańców Europy. W tej chwili kilkanaście tysięcy polskich funkcjonariuszy i żołnierzy patroluje wschodnią granicę Unii Europejskiej. Po raz pierwszy od czasu żelaznej kurtyny integralność granic Polski i krajów bałtyckich jest zagrożona. To jest długi cień neoimperialnej polityki Rosji. Od kilkunastu tygodni Łukaszenko posyła każdego dnia na granicę setki cywilów. I to nie jest wcale powtórzenie kryzysu migracyjnego z 2015 roku. Mamy do czynienia z zaplanowaną akcją prowokacyjną, której migranci są tylko narzędziami Łukaszenki, a celem jest destabilizacja w Europie. Zamiarów Łukaszenki nie trzeba dowodzić. On sam dostarcza takich dowodów. Zmasakrujemy wszystkie szumowiny, które wy, czyli Zachód, finansowaliście. Te słowa nie padły na tajnej naradzie, wypowiedział je Łukaszenko w telewizji BBC. Rosja Władimira Putina od lat konsekwentnie dąży do odbudowania pozycji imperialnej i podporządkowania sobie części Europy. Jej siłą jest nasza bierność. Kiedy napadała na Gruzję, nie byliśmy w stanie jej się przeciwstawić. Kiedy wydzierała Ukrainie Krym, nie byliśmy w stanie jej powstrzymać. Kiedy Łukaszenka fałszował wybory prezydenckie, zabrakło nam determinacji, by obronić naród białoruski przed dyktaturą. Kiedy sam Władimir Putin zaczynał rozgrywkę, której celem było rozgrywanie interesów poszczególnych krajów europejskich, zabrakło nam solidarności, która postawiłaby tamę budowie gazociągu Nord Stream 2. Piszę my, choć Polska w każdej z tych spraw od początku zgłaszała stanowczy sprzeciw. Piszę my, bo ofiarami tej polityki w dłuższej perspektywie jesteśmy wszyscy, cała Europa. Na wschodnich granicach Unii Europejskiej, na granicy polsko-białoruskiej toczy się regularna bitwa o przyszłość Europy. Czas najwyższy, byśmy sobie to uświadomili. To konflikt, który toczy się na polu informacji, bo niemal każdego dnia farmy rosyjskich trolli bombardują sieć internetową fake newsami. Konflikt toczy się w cyberprzestrzeni. Nie ma tygodnia bez doniesienia o cyberatakach pochodzących ze wschodu. Ten konflikt toczy się na polu gospodarczym, gdzie co chwila Rosja szantażuje kolejne państwa zakręceniem kurków z gazem. A jednocześnie nie oznacza, że Rosja zrezygnowała z bezpośrednich form przemocy, o czym mogą zaświadczyć polscy, litewscy czy łotewscy żołnierze. Potrzebujemy jasnych zasad, które pozwolą Europie przejąć inicjatywę i zablokować kolejne działania Putina i Łukaszenki. Po pierwsze, żadnych ustępstw. Sprawy zaszły za daleko. Rosja i Białoruś przekroczyły już wszystkie granice i na więcej pozwolić nie można. Po drugie, nic o nas bez nas. Każda próba rozwiązania konfliktu musi bazować na porozumieniu. Każda próba negocjacji z pominięciem niektórych państw to sukces Władimira Putina. Po trzecie, solidarność wobec wspólnego zagrożenia. Nie dotyczy ta sprawa Polski, Litwy, Łotwy, Estonii, to jest sprawa szersza. Po czwarte, słowa już nie wystarczą. Musimy działać zdecydowanie, między innymi przez sankcje. Po piąte, współpraca transatlantycka. Ten konflikt ma wymiar starcia cywilizacyjnego i wymaga to stosownej odpowiedzi nie tylko w ramach Unii Europejskiej, ale poszerzyć także współpracę o NATO. Po szóste, wspólna polityka energetyczna. Unia jest przedmiotem szantażu energetycznego Rosji, dlatego że nadal w polityce energetycznej gramy przeciw sobie, a nie dla siebie nawzajem. Dopóki to się nie zmieni, możemy być pewni, że Putin będzie rozgrywał te interesy na swoją korzyść. Po siódme i ostatnie wreszcie, Europa to więcej niż Unia Europejska. Państwa, które pozostają poza Unią, takie jak Ukraina czy Mołdawia, muszą dostać sygnał, że nie zostaną same na pastwę neoimperialnej polityki Moskwy. musimy wrócić z większą energią do idei poszerzenia Unii o nowych członków. To jest 7 kroków, na które musimy się zdobyć. Inaczej Europa stanie w miejscu, a grunt pod nami zacznie się zapadać. Bezpieczeństwo Europy to nasza wspólna sprawa. Na tym polega najgłębszy sens sojuszy, aby w chwili próby stanąć w jednym szeregu. I te sojusze powinny być potwierdzone nie tylko słowami, ale konkretnymi decyzjami, czynami politycznymi. Dziękuję bardzo. Thank you, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, when in 2008 the Russian army invaded Georgia, Poland's President Lech Kaczyński gathered political leaders from Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in Tbilisi. And at the public meeting, he said these memorable words. Today it is Georgia, tomorrow Ukraine, then the Baltic states, and in the future, maybe Poland. Well, unfortunately, these words are not only memorable, but they sound prophetic too. But there is a discrepancy between East European and West European political sensibilities. For most East Europeans, Russian imperialism is a fact that has determined and continues to determine their very existence. For the West Europeans, it is simply news in the media, sometimes sensational and exciting, but generally it is a rather tedious story in a far-off land, presumably made up by some political fantasists. To make the matter worse, Russia has become an object of deep attraction for many Europeans, and additionally an engaging partner in power politics, also in economic relations, not to mention the notorious Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. And the fact that former chancellors of Germany and Austria, former prime ministers of France and Finland have been working for Russian businesses, were employed by Russian businesses, is meaningful. These gentlemen, and many others too, also ladies, let me add, are not mavericks, but they represent what is typical of a large segment of European political establishment. To call a spade, Europe is a weak link in the line of defense against Russian imperialism. No wonder that Putin likes to humiliate the European politicians and has been quite successful in this. Those politicians desire to accommodate Russia and are keen on conducting business as usual with her. And this is the reason why they de facto accepted the annexation of the Crimea. Well, recent signals from Europe and also from outside Europe have been rather mixed, but there is a lot of reassuring talk about the hardening of the European position vis-à-vis Russia. We've heard a lot of tough words today, really a significant EU pep talk. But how hard this position has really become, not in words, but in deeds, we will know in the weeks and months to come.
Madam President, the war created an entirely new situation, and we have to do everything we can to win this war, because it's our war, the war of all European nations. Once Putin decided to go ahead with the invasion, it became clear he is determined to subdue Ukraine and will not hesitate to resort to the extreme measures. It was he who once said, let me remind you,
that the collapse of the Soviet Union had been the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the century. So there should be no misunderstanding as to his intentions. He plans to create what was once the Soviet Empire, perhaps not with one stroke, but that is definitely his final objective. Moreover, he has been more or less open about it all along. The Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian people are opposing the invaders, and they desperately need some military backup arms and other tools of defense. Fortunately, after the initial opposition from some countries, nowadays it is about 20 governments, I think, that started helping the Ukrainians. And it's very good that some time ago in the Council, the member states decided to create European Peace Facility, and that these funds can be now used to help Ukraine. And I'm proud to say that it is my government that was first to propose as early as Thursday morning to activate European Peace Facility. So the flow of arms, the flow of necessary technology and other means of defense must continue. Whatever the effects of the sanctions, who will win the war will be ultimately decided on the battlefield. And finally, I must say this. I'm sorry, I must say this, because as usual, the EU is, with its narcissistic and self-congratulatory proclivities, likes to escape responsibility. Putin made his decision because he was induced by the weakness of the West. Let us be frank. He did not think much of the Western leaders, and it showed. He didn't hide it. And in a way, he was right, having been for a long time pampered by the French and German governments, by some American administrations, also by the European Commission that was both unable and unwilling to stymie the Nord Stream projects. To those Western leaders and governments that took upon themselves the job of dealing with Russia, particularly to the German politicians, but not only to them, we must say today, ladies and gentlemen, you blew it, and your leadership credibility is gone. It's time for a reset, and let us start by enabling Ukraine to join the European Union.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, for anyone who has eyes to see, it must become clear that Putin's war will continue and that the EU's reaction has not brought the expected results. Despite the narcissistic, self-indulgent and self-congratulatory rhetoric of the European leaders, the sanctions have too many loopholes, and some of the West European governments are beginning to have second thoughts. They modify their position or quibble over technicalities. The SWIFT blockade, which was to be an atomic bomb, so far resembles more a firework. The ban on the hydrocarbons proposed, among others, by Poland and Latvia was not accepted by the Council. Instead, President Macron continues his absurd telephone conversations with Putin, and the German government continues its typical self-serving political game. And this European hesitancy is precisely what Putin must have counted on when deciding to invade Ukraine. In the meantime, Russian economy has become stabilized, more or less. Moscow exchange is gaining profits. Russian ruble has gone up, and Gazprom gets 900 million euros a day. And there is a time factor. Putin has all the time he needs. He has wide support among the Russian population. His army is not badly equipped. He has been devastating Ukraine with the arms he bought from France, Germany, and 8 other European countries, and this after the arms embargo that followed the annexation of Crimea. And Ukraine does not have time as the war is being waged on her territory. People are killed, the city is ruined. Does Europe have time? Let us not delude ourselves. With the passing of time, Western Europe's reaction will weaken and a desire to have some sort of normalization will increase. This happened in the past more than once, and I'm afraid it might happen in the future. Anyway, I wouldn't bet it won't.
Dziękuję bardzo. Szanowni Państwo, organizowanie absurdalnych debat, a takich było wiele, to wydaje się spécialité de la maison tego parlamentu, a ten poziom absurdu przekracza nawet najbardziej zaniżone standardy racjonalności. Obecna debata jest nie tylko absurdalna, ale powiedziałbym, że jest niegodziwa. Tu się zwracam do posłów spoza Polski, którzy tę debatę popierają. Proszę Państwa, przecież wy o Polsce nic nie wiecie o tej instytucji. Ja to słyszę, koleżanka mówiła coś o Izbie Dyscyplinarnej i wyraziła taki entuzjazm, że Izba Dyscyplinarna jest likwidowana. Przecież ta pani nie ma zielonego pojęcia, czym się zajmuje Izba Dyscyplinarna i co ona robi. 0, 0 po prostu. Mówi się, że Polska, słyszałem też dzisiaj takie określenie, Polska ma, nie wiem, rząd autorytarny. Polska ma rząd autorytarny? W Polsce jest też 1000 razy więcej wolności niż w takim kraju jak Hiszpania, która jest rządzona przez niezwykle represywny i nieprzyjemny rząd. Co wy w ogóle mówicie? 0, po prostu 0 wiedzy, kompletna ignorancja, tylko napędzanie się taką ideologiczną nienawiścią i nabzdyczeniem. Czego ja oczywiście jako obserwator życia publicznego, co mogę jakoś zrozumieć, ale no nie tak nad tym ubolewam. Niedawno jedna z pań europosłanek użyła takiego wyrażenia, że Polskę należy finansowo zagłodzić. Ja rozumiem, że Parlament Europejski też przyjął tę strategię finansowego zagłodzenia Polski. Słowo zagłodzenie brzmi bardzo nieprzyjemnym echem, bo odnosi się do wyjątkowo paskudnej tradycji politycznej i jak mówię, dla polskiego ucha brzmi strasznie, ale jednak prawda jest taka, że ten parlament rzeczywiście taką strategię przyjął. I to jest, muszę powiedzieć, no, bardzo smutne, ale uderza mnie ten kłamliwy język, który tutaj pada. Kiedy mówicie Państwo o demokracji, tak naprawdę nie chodzi wam wcale o demokrację, wam chodzi o tyranię jednej grupy. Kiedy mówicie o wartościach, tak naprawdę chodzi wam o zastraszanie i szantaż. Kiedy mówicie o praworządności, chodzi o zdobycie dodatkowej pałki na przeciwników. Znaczy, ja jestem tym zdegustowany. W roku 2004 Polska wchodziła do Unii Europejskiej, nawet najwięksi przeciwnicy Unii w moim kraju i poza nim nie wyobrazili sobie takiej podobnej degeneracji. Proszę Państwa, siejecie wiatr i prędzej czy później będziecie zbierać burzę. Madam President, Prime Ministers, 2 minutes of truth, of bitter truth. And the bitter truth is that the European Parliament has done a lot of damage in Europe. It has been sending a false message. It represents the European demos. There isn't, and there won't be any European demos. The Parliament infected Europe with shameless partisanship. And the infection became so contagious that it spread to other institutions, such as the European Commission. The Parliament The Parliament has abandoned the basic function of representing people. Instead, it has become a machine to implement the so-called European project, thus alienating millions of voters. The Parliament has become a political vehicle of the left to impose their monopoly with their fierce intolerance towards any dissenting view. No matter how many times you repeat the word diversity, diversity is becoming an extinct species in the European Union, and particularly in this chamber. The Parliament is a quasi-parliament because it rejects the essential principle of parliamentarism, namely accountability. The deputy, let me remind you, is elected by the voters and must be accountable to the voters that elected him. Not so in the European Union. The idea that, say, Spanish, German, French, etc., deputies accountable to their own national electorates can dictate something to, shall we say, a Hungarian society or any other society to which they cannot be held accountable and which cannot take them to task is simply preposterous. Call it what you will, but democracy it is not. To sum up, the Parliament represents the demos that does not exist, works for the project that ignores reality and law, shuns accountability, turns its back on millions of people, and serves the interest of one political orientation. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Having said that, ladies and gentlemen, I rest my case. Thank you, Madam President. Well, there is not much to be said. A lot of facts have already come out, and I'm sure more will come out in the future. Perhaps some of them are quite surprising in a most unpleasant sort of way. But you were right, of course, Madam President, that European Parliament was targeted by the bad guys, and probably they consider the Parliament to be a place with several weak spots, and indeed they succeeded to a degree that shocked a lot of us. So I always wonder and ask myself, to what extent is it a problem of personal weaknesses of our colleagues, former colleagues or staffers, and to what extent is it a problem of a system, of a structure and rules and procedures? Probably both elements should be taken into account, and I wish there could be some kind of critical, objective analysis of this phenomenon. After all, this is a huge institution, very complex and not easy to manage. But such a critical analysis should be conducted by somebody from outside, not from our midst, for obvious reasons, that we are more interested in sustaining this institution and defending it, no matter what we say openly. So I would suggest that
we should have a sort of critical description of the way such an institution functions. Perhaps that would give us an insight into what was wrong and how to prevent similar developments from happening in the future. And one last point, one thing that will certainly not improve the reputation of European Parliament, pompous, highfalutin rhetoric. I mean, this will not help. I mean, I have an impression that we very much like to indulge in sort of lofty language that didn't help in the future, hasn't helped and won't help. Just do something real. We want the real thing, not rhetoric. Rhetoric is a very easy thing.
Madam President, Mr. Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen.
Can you please listen to your colleague?
To understand the role of Germany, one needs to start with the basic question. What sort of political system is the European Union? And I submit it is a combination of an oligarchy and a tyranny of the majority. The Parliament functions, of course, as the tyranny of the majority, and the Commission is a typically oligarchic institution, unelected, with limited democratic legitimacy, and having an unquestionable lust for power. And as far as I could understand you, Mr. Chancellor, you want this body to have even more power. But the pillars of European oligarchy are the big guys among the member states. And the biggest is, of course, Germany. The big guys do what they want, never bother to consult anyone, and call it leadership. And with the voting system in the Council securing their interest, there is little chance they could be outvoted. Of many sins that the German governments have committed, let me mention two. The migration crisis, when Germany single-handedly opened the EU borders, and recently the energy and security crisis, which resulted from its having a long and murky tradition political romance with Russia. Today, the German politicians beat their breasts and promise to be good boys in the future. Well, the problem with the big guys is they can promise anything, and repentance as easy for them as it is inconsequential. When I heard that the best option would be the gradual abolition of the veto and the abolition of the veto in foreign policy, I simply cannot believe my ears. The Russian policy was the most spectacular disaster of the EU's big guys. And those who are most responsible for this want to have more power in foreign policy. The logic behind it boggles the mind. The more we screw up, the more power we want. The logic would be the reverse. Because you screw up so much, you should be kept in check for as long as possible. Chancellor Scholz, I do not have any illusions about Germany mending its ways. You are too big, you are too hubristic. Especially lately, I read your statement, and I heard something like this today also, about Germany taking responsibility for the EU. Just a matter of interest, if you could satisfy my intellectual curiosity, where can one read about German responsibility for the EU in the treaties? The only proper thing for the German governments would be to take the back benches and, as political hygiene requires, let others run the show.
Mr. Legutko,
you tried,
thank you very much.
You failed, you should withdraw. Unless, Mr. Chancellor, you and your colleagues in the European oligarchy believe that German leaders, like diamonds, are forever. Is the EU in better shape today than, shall we say, 20 years ago? The answer is emphatic no. To
paraphrase Shakespeare's Hamlet, something is rotten in the state of the Union. There is more than ever instability, conflict, tension, and uncertainty. Let me quote a recent issue of The Economist. Inflation remains hot. Officials are increasingly worried by the cloudy growth outlook. The bloc is facing recession, unquote. It is to your credit, Madam President, that you initiated and continue the sanctions against Russia. But again, one cannot be all too happy. Before the invasion, the Commission did not dare to do something about the German-Russian energy alliance. Through this refusal to act, the Commission bears some responsibility for the depth of the energy crisis. The migration policy has been a failure. Despite the Commission's hustle and bustle and fiery rhetoric, the people smuggling business is thriving, and the disintegration of the social fabric continues. In Western Europe, the number of thefts, robberies, and rapes has soared. About 30 rapes for 100,000 inhabitants in France and Belgium, compared to less than 2 in my country. The Green Deal, the Commission's flagship, instead of being a vehicle of growth, is a costly extravaganza, over 300 billion euros by 2030, with rising living costs, energy bills, and other unpleasant aspects of the Commission's and the Parliament's fantasies. The Commission has been unsurprisingly silent on this matter. The last sinister fantasy is the nature restoration law. The curator of these harmful reveries, Mr. Timmermans, has taken a convenient exit and seeks his luck in national politics. I hope Dutch voters will give him what he deserves. Another financial extravaganza has been the common debt of 800 billion euros by 2026. We already know the predictions were erroneous. The cost of all this will be at least twice as high. The EU budget is in shambles, minus 66 billion euros as of today. You apparently calculated that the markets would have had more trust in the financial credibility of the EU than that of the member states. Unfortunately, you mistook the EU propaganda for the real thing. And finally, politics. When I compare the past Commission with yours, I see a continuous slide towards oligarchy, with a growing disregard for any restraints the treaties stipulated. The Commission turned into a partisan machine, meddling in national politics, trying to topple the governments they don't like. You yourself, Madam President, threatened the Italian voters before the elections. Let me quote you: "If things go in a difficult direction, we have tools," you said. Let me remind you, you don't have any tools to interfere with the democratic process of the nation state. Mr. Lukashenko has such tools. You don't. You made the rule of law a caricature. There is an old proverb, "Physician, heal thyself." Heal thyself, Madam President. For one thing, let the Commission stop juggling with the legal basis, claiming, for instance, that taxes are not taxes, but contributions, thus sidestepping the necessary procedures. And perhaps start by providing all the documents relevant to the vaccines deal, including the text messages. That would be a good example of how to be a law-abiding person. And the last point. Believe it or not, but this Commission will go in history as one that tried to regulate the language of the European Union. and to establish a sort of officially sanctioned indoctrination. For instance, by abolishing certain words, such as Christmas. Yes, you withdrew from this idiotic move. But the fact is that the bureaucrats were planning it. A large bunch of the European Commission had been working on how we should speak and how we should avoid the word Christmas. I mean, this is simply outrageous. So, but this gives us an insight into how the Commission works. And what we see should be a warning to us all. President, the report is a living proof of how dangerous the EU has become. One is reminded of a well-known story about Dr. Frankenstein, who wanted to create a perfect being, and instead he created a monster. What the report proposes is the grabbing of all essential competences of the member states, thereby reducing the national institutions to ornamental functions. Should the reform come into effect, they will have less power than German Länder. Who the hell do you think you are to place your souls above the member states? You do not have the legislative initiative, thank heavens for that. Your democratic legitimacy is scarce, your record lamentable, your respect for law non-existent. You want to govern the entire continent, but they're not even capable of supplying hot water in the building. Unfortunately, the EU will probably go about it in the traditional EU way, keeping millions of people out of it and exerting pressure on national institutions by all sorts of foul tricks. And the final point, it is not that some part of the project are good and some are somewhat excessive. All of it should be rejected and never ever brought back again.